Rain was falling over the industrial district on the south side of Chicago that night, as though the sky were trying to wash away everything beneath it. Maeve Bellamy was walking, not running, walking with the deliberate steps of someone who had decided that any direction was better than the one she had just left behind. No coat, no money, no phone. Only the October night, and the damp, metallic smell of abandoned warehouses, and the knife-sharp freedom of someone who had just chosen movement, instead of enduring one more day. She had walked out of the place where she lived 47 minutes earlier, and she wasn't going back. The rain had started softly, then turned resolute, the kind of October rain in Chicago that has already decided it isn't going to stop. Maeve looked down the old industrial road. Not a soul in sight, not a single streetlight still working. She saw the warehouse at the corner, its steel door slightly ajar, darkness inside, the smell of old machine oil slipping out through the opening. She slid inside, pressed her back against the cold concrete wall, and breathed. She counted her breaths. She always counted. When she reached the 34th breath, she heard voices, not the voices of people passing by. These were low, even, controlled voices. The kind of voices that belonged to someone bringing a conversation to an end after it had all been planned in advance. Maeve held her breath. She pressed one eye to the gap in the steel door, the parking lot behind the warehouse. 4 men. Headlights from 3 black SUVs cast their shadows long across the wet concrete. 3 were standing. 1 was kneeling. The man on his knees was saying something, calm, controlled, in the voice of a man negotiating with something that couldn't be negotiated with. One of the 3 standing men stepped forward, not in a hurry, not in doubt, and fired. 1 shot, into the stomach. Slow, intentional. The kneeling man fell onto one side on the wet concrete. He didn't cry out. His body folded around the wound as though trying to keep something inside himself from spilling out. The other 3 men got into the vehicles. The headlights went dark. The 3 SUVs pulled out onto the road, one after another, evenly spaced, and then disappeared into the rain. 4 minutes, from beginning to end. Maeve stood inside the dark warehouse, her back against the wall, both hands flattened against the cold concrete. She counted. 1, 2, 3, up to 120, and there was complete silence. Then came a groan, very faint, almost swallowed by the rain, but Maeve heard it, because she had spent 11 years listening for the small sounds ordinary people never notice. The man was still alive. Maeve stood in the warehouse. She could stay where she was. She could slip back into the dark, press herself into the wall, and wait for morning. No one knew she was here. No one would ever know. She could do the safe thing. She had done the safe thing for 11 years. The groan came again, smaller, weaker, as though the person making it were losing his reason to keep making any sound at all. She looked through the gap in the steel door. The man was still lying there. Rain was falling on him. Blood spread across the concrete, diluted by the water into a pale pink wash that kept widening around him. She counted to 3. Then, she pushed the steel door open and stepped out into the darkness. She didn't know who the man lying in the parking lot was. She didn't know he controlled the entire underground network of South Chicago. She didn't know that tonight, the night she had walked out with nothing in her hands, would be the night that changed everything. She only knew that someone was bleeding in the dark, and she knew how to stop the bleeding. For Maeve Bellamy, that was enough. But to understand why she stepped forward, why she, a woman with nothing, was the only one who acted, we need to go back to the beginning. Back 11 years to when it all began. Back to the house and the woman who stepped into it 2 years later and slowly, methodically, day by day, over more than a decade, took Maeve's life apart piece by piece. Back to all of it, and tell you everything. If this story touched you, press like right now, so it can reach more people. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it. And if this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel, because stories like this are waiting for you every week. 11 years before that night, Maeve Bellamy was 16, and her mother was dying. Lorraine Bellamy lay in a hospital bed set up in their living room on Bellamy Street, because Lorraine had said that if she had to go, she would go at home, looking out at the garden she had planted, not at the white ceiling of Cook County Hospital. Cervical cancer. 3 months from the day of diagnosis to the day it ended. 3 months that Lorraine used to put in order everything she could still put in order, and to accept that there were things she couldn't. Maeve sat beside her mother's bed through the entire final week. She didn't go to school. She didn't eat unless Lorraine told her to eat. She sat there holding her mother's hand and watching her grow smaller, lighter, as though Lorraine's body were slowly erasing itself from the room a little at a time. On the last night, Lorraine woke at 2 o'clock in the morning. Her eyes opened, clear and steady, fully present in a way they hadn't been in the days before. She looked at Maeve. She took her daughter's hand, tighter than at any moment in the past week. Then she said, her voice very soft but clear down to every syllable, "Count. Sweetheart, count for me." Maeve didn't understand, but she counted. 1, 2, 3. She counted slowly, evenly, looking at her mother, and Lorraine looked back at her, and each number was another second the two of them still had together. She counted through the tens, through the hundreds. She doesn't remember what number she stopped on. She only remembers that at some point, her mother's hand turned cold. Not suddenly, just that the warmth slowly withdrew, as though Lorraine were letting go little by little, instead of being torn away. Maeve stayed sitting there for another 20 minutes, after her mother's hand had gone completely cold. She didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, because her mother had told her, "You cry later. Right now, you stay here with me." She had stayed. And from that night on, Maeve counted everything. Franklin Bellamy collapsed the way men collapse when they lose the only person who had ever kept them standing. Not loudly, not dramatically. He simply stopped functioning. For 2 years, Franklin sat in the chair by the living room window and looked out at the garden Lorraine had left behind without seeing any of it. He drank, not to forget, but because there was no reason strong enough not to drink. Maeve cooked for him, cleared the bottles, washed his shirts, went to school, came home, cooked again. She was 16, then 17, and she ran the house alone on habit and precision, and something she would only later realize was the only way she knew not to fall apart. Count and do, count and do, never stop. Judith Price appeared when Maeve was 18. At a community fundraiser for the county library, held in the fellowship hall of the Methodist Church on Ashland Street, Franklin went because Dr. Vance said he needed to leave the house. He stood in the corner of the room with a glass of orange juice and the face of a man who was there but not truly there. Judith saw him from across the room. She recognized his loneliness at once, with the instinct of someone who had looked at many rooms and always known exactly what could be taken from each one. She walked toward him, not quickly, naturally. She asked him about the painting on the wall, then about the library, then about the garden someone had mentioned, then about Lorraine. And when she asked about Lorraine, her voice softened at exactly the right place, exactly the right moment, exactly the right degree. Franklin spoke about his wife for the first time in 2 years to a stranger who seemed to be listening, and he didn't realize that Judith wasn't listening to Lorraine. She was listening to him, measuring the emptiness inside him, calculating how far in she had already stepped. After that, everything moved very fast. Judith came to the Bellamy house to visit Franklin. Then she came for dinner. Then she stayed late. Then she stayed the night. She was warm, attentive, and knew how to say the right sentence in the right silence. She brought her daughter with her, Brinley, 19 years old, blonde, with a practiced smile, the kind of beauty people call striking because it was designed to strike. 8 months, from the fundraiser to the wedding. Franklin wore a suit and smiled for the first time in 2 years, and Maeve stood in the front row watching her father marry a woman she had never once seen cry while speaking about anything. Maeve was 18, Brinley was 19. 2 girls, 1 house, and from the first week Judith moved in, everything began to change. Not suddenly, not loudly, just one small thing shifting at a time, one new rule appearing after another. One part of the house that had once belonged to Maeve, growing narrower and narrower, slowly, methodically, as though someone were redrawing the map of the home without telling her that she was no longer on it. The change didn't come through a declaration or a single event. It came through thousands of small things, stacked one on top of another, until Maeve no longer recognized the house she was living in. In the first month, Judith suggested that Maeve help make breakfast, because Judith isn't used to this kitchen yet. In the second month, Judith said Maeve should clean the living room because you know this house better than anyone. By the third month, there were no more suggestions. There were only lists. And by the 6th month, Maeve was waking up at 4:30 every morning, not because anyone told her to wake up, but because if she didn't, nothing would get done. And if nothing got done, Judith would notice. And when Judith noticed, That day would become the kind of day Maeve had learned to avoid at any cost. 4:30. Kitchen. Breakfast for Franklin, for Judith, for Brinley. 3 different menus, because Judith didn't eat eggs, Brinley didn't eat gluten, and Franklin would eat anything. But Judith said he needed low-sodium food. After breakfast, clear the table. Wash the dishes. Wipe down the counters. Go upstairs to clean Judith's room and Brinley's room. Change the sheets. Vacuum. Clean the windows. Back downstairs. The living room. The dining room. The hallway. Laundry. Hang it out. Iron it. Cook lunch. Clean up. Cook dinner. Clean up. Mop the kitchen floor. Check every room one last time. Turn off the lights. Go up to her own room, the smallest room at the end of the upstairs hallway. The room that had once been a storage room, with no working heater and no curtains thick enough to keep out the January wind off Chicago. She wasn't paid. She wasn't thanked. She was told what she had done wrong. Every Monday, Judith carried out what she called the house inspection. She moved from room to room, her hand touching the tops of shelves, her fingers gliding across windowsills, her eyes sweeping every corner with the concentration of someone searching for something she already knew she would find. Brinley came along. Always. Brinley walked behind her mother with the easy comfort of a girl who had been given a privileged seat in the spectacle of someone else's humiliation. "There's a streak on the living room window," Judith would say. Maeve cleaned it again. "Dust on the stair rail," Judith would say, holding up her finger like evidence. Maeve cleaned it again. "The laundry room doesn't smell right." Maeve didn't know what the right smell was, but she changed the fabric softener and didn't ask. Brinley watched. Brinley always watched. And on a Tuesday morning in March, Brinley sent back the breakfast tray. "The eggs are too cold," Brinley said. Maeve took it downstairs, made fresh eggs, and carried it back up. "Wrong milk," Brinley said. "I drink almond milk." Maeve took it downstairs, changed the milk, and carried it back up. "The toast is too dark," Brinley said. And this time Maeve saw something in Brinley's eyes that she would remember forever. Not irritation, but pleasure. The small, private kind of pleasure of someone testing how far she could push before meeting resistance. Maeve carried the tray back down to the kitchen, stood at the sink, counted to 30. Then made new toast and brought it upstairs without saying a word. But what Judith did in the dark was worse than anything she did in plain sight. Every night at 9 o'clock, Judith made tea for Franklin. She carried it upstairs with the smile of a devoted wife, and Franklin drank it because Franklin believed in that smile, because he was too tired and too lonely to doubt anything that resembled kindness. Maeve began to understand when she was 22, not all at once, but through the accumulation of hundreds of small observations. The way Franklin grew slower and slower, the way he forgot the names of things, forgot whether he had eaten, forgot what day it was, the way he sat in the chair by the window and stared out at the garden, with eyes Maeve had once seen sharp, now clouded as if the lenses had fogged over. The way Judith stood in the bedroom doorway looking at him with an expression she called concern. But Maeve, who had spent 11 years learning how to read Judith's face, knew it wasn't concern. It was inventory. It was the deeply hidden satisfaction of someone watching a plan unfold on schedule. Maeve started counting. Not counting to hold herself together this time, but counting to keep record. She counted the pills Judith took from the bottle in the bedroom drawer. 2 pills every night, sometimes 3. She counted the minutes from the moment Franklin drank the tea to the moment his eyes began to go dull. 14 minutes with 2 pills, 9 minutes with 3. She counted the days Franklin forgot her name in a single month. 7 days at first, then 12, then 19. She wrote it all down in a small notebook, the cheap, black-covered kind bought from the Walgreens on the corner, and she hid it beneath the loose floorboard in the corner of her room, the floorboard she had discovered when she was 19 and used to hide the only thing of her mother's she had managed to keep, a photograph of Lorraine in the summer garden before the illness. The notebook lay beside the photograph. For 5 years, Maeve kept records. Every night she sat on the bed in the room without heat, opened the notebook, and wrote the date, the time, the number of pills, the symptoms. She didn't know what she would ever use it for. She only knew that she was counting, and that one day the numbers would grow large enough that someone would have to listen. In the 11 years Maeve spent recording and enduring and counting, there were only a few times when she saw her father truly there. Not Franklin sitting in the window chair with fog over his eyes, but the real Franklin, the man from before Judith, before the pills, before the haze. The last time was on a Sunday afternoon in September. Maeve was dusting the study when she heard her father call her name. Not the confused calling when he mistook her for Lorraine. Her name. Clear. Correct. In the right voice. Maeve. She stopped what she was doing. Went in. Franklin was sitting at the desk, back straight, eyes clear, and the moment she looked at him, she understood that today was one of those rare days when the medicine hadn't fully taken hold yet, or his body had somehow fought it off, and her father was here, fully present, like a man who had finally broken the surface after a long time at the bottom. "Sit down," he said. Maeve sat, and for the next hour, Franklin talked about Lorraine, not in the way sick people talk, scattered and repetitive, but in the way of a man remembering his wife with a memory still intact. He told her about the first time he met Lorraine in the emergency room at Cook County Hospital. She was the night shift nurse, and he had come in because he had broken a finger while repairing a roof, and she looked at his finger, then looked at him, then said, "You do know you don't need an emergency room for this, right?" And he said, "I know, but I wanted to meet someone interesting tonight." Maeve listened, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt something warm in the place she had thought had gone cold for good. Her father was here, truly here. Then Judith appeared in the doorway. She looked at the two of them, looked at the clarity in Franklin's eyes, looked at the way Maeve was sitting close to him, and something moved across her face very quickly, too quickly for anyone else to notice, but not too quickly for Maeve, who had spent 11 years reading that face. It wasn't concern. It was calculation. "I'll bring your tea up for you," Judith said, her voice as warm as ever. "Dr. Vance told you to drink it on time." She turned away. She came back 4 minutes later with the teacup, set it in front of Franklin, the smile perfect. Maeve watched her father lift the cup. She wanted to say something. She wanted to knock the teacup out of his hand, but she didn't speak and she didn't strike it away, because she still didn't have enough to prove it, because the notebook beneath the floorboard still wasn't thick enough, because if she spoke now, Judith would know she knew, and everything would change in a direction Maeve couldn't control. So she sat there, and she counted. Franklin drank. 1 sip, 2 sips, 3. 14 seconds after the last swallow, his eyes began to cloud. Those eyes that had just been clear, that had just looked at her, that had just spoken of Lorraine, were covered again by the familiar fog. The window closed. Franklin looked at Maeve but didn't see Maeve anymore. He looked through her into some place the medicine had taken him. Judith stood in the doorway, watching. Then she smiled at Maeve, a small smile, and said, "Clean the dining room. We have guests coming next week, and things need to be ready." 3 weeks later, Judith hosted a dinner. 12 guests, all of them South Chicago high society, the kind of people Judith needed to know in order to build the place she was building for herself. Maeve prepared everything. 4 days of cooking, setting the table, cleaning the house, polishing every crystal glass with a soft cloth until not a single mark remained. On the night of the dinner, Maeve was in the kitchen. She heard laughter from the dining room, the touch of glasses, Judith speaking in the voice she reserved for the people she needed to impress, warmer than usual by 2 degrees. Then she heard a woman ask, her voice carrying clearly through the half-open kitchen door, "And who is the girl in the kitchen? She cooks beautifully." Silence for 2 seconds. Then Judith's voice, gentle, effortless, not a second of hesitation. "Oh, that's our maid." Maeve stood at the sink, her hands in hot soapy water, and heard those 4 words come through the kitchen door and enter her, and stop in the place she had thought had already grown numb. Our maid. Not Franklin's daughter. Not Maeve. The maid. In 11 years, Judith had taken things from her one by one. Her bedroom, decent meals, sleep, her father's health. But she had still had her name. She had still been Franklin Bellamy's daughter. And tonight Judith took that too. Maeve pulled her hands out of the water, counted. 1, 2, 3. She dried her hands on a towel. She walked through the kitchen door into the hallway, past the dining room where the 12 guests were seated, past Judith standing at the head of the table, straight to the front door. Judith looked at her. Everyone looked at her. "Maeve," Judith said, her voice still warm but her eyes not. "Go back to the kitchen." Maeve put her hand on the doorknob. "If you walk through that door," Judith said, "don't come back." Maeve opened the door. The October night rushed in, cold and damp and smelling of dead leaves. She stepped through. She didn't look back. Maeve knelt on the wet concrete beside the man and placed 2 fingers against his neck. There was a pulse. Fast, But there. She looked at the wound, right side of the abdomen, below the last rib, blood flowing steadily but not spurting. Not the aorta. She knew that because Lorraine had taught her, on Sunday afternoons when Maeve was 13, 14, and her mother had just come home from her shift, still wearing her nurse's uniform, sitting at the kitchen table and teaching her daughter the things she said everyone ought to know. Press hard. Don't lift your hand. If the blood soaks through, add another layer on top. Never take away the first one. Keep pressure. Keep the person warm. Keep them awake if you can. Maeve took off her outer layer, folded it into a thick pad, and pressed it against the wound. Blood soaked through the fabric at once, warm and sticky on her fingers. She pressed harder. The man groaned, very faintly, then opened his eyes. Gray eyes. Not pale gray, but dark gray, the color of the Chicago sky before a storm. And even while he was bleeding out on concrete in the rain, those eyes were still sharp, still reading her, still assessing her in the span of time most people would have used only to hurt. "Who?" he said. One word, his voice low and rough but clear. "Doesn't matter," Maeve said. "You've been shot. I need to find your phone to call 911. No." His eyes opened wider. His voice was suddenly startlingly clear for a man with a bullet in his stomach. "No hospital, no police." Maeve looked at him, looked at the blood, looked at the empty lot where the 3 SUVs had disappeared, looked back at him. She understood, not the details, but the shape of it. With the instinct of someone who had spent 11 years in a house where the most dangerous things happened, without anyone ever calling the police. This man wasn't an ordinary victim. That shooting hadn't been a robbery, and the reason he didn't want the police wasn't because he was afraid. It was because the police belonged to a different world from the one he lived in. She could stand up, walk away, call 911 anyway, and let the system handle it. No one would blame her. She looked at him. He looked back at her. His blood was warm on her hands. "You're bleeding," Maeve said. "I don't need to know why. Where do you need to go?" Something moved in those gray eyes. Not gratitude. Too early for gratitude. Closer to surprise. The kind of surprise that belongs to someone who has stopped expecting anyone to do anything without a reason. 1443 North Lakemont, he said. Then his eyes closed, and his body grew heavier under her hands, and he said nothing more. Maeve kept pressure on the wound. Looked around. A black sedan was parked about 200 meters away, on the other side of the lot beneath the shadow of the warehouse awning. She looked back at the man, looked at the car. She didn't know how to drive. She was 27 years old, and had never sat behind a steering wheel, because Judith had never let her learn, and before Judith she had been 16, and her mother had been dying, and nobody had been thinking about teaching her to drive. But she had watched. 11 years of watching other people drive. Watching Judith drive. Watching Brinley drive. Watching Franklin drive, before he could no longer do it. She had counted every time they pressed the brake, pressed the gas, turned the wheel. She had counted because she counted everything. She dragged the man toward the car. He was heavy, much heavier than she had expected, and she was much smaller than this required. But she pulled with both hands under his arms, step by step, tracking the rhythm of her own strain, and got him into the back seat. She used the blood-soaked outer layer to press back against the wound, placed his hand over it to hold it there, even though he was unconscious, and his hand would slip, and she knew that, but she didn't have a better option. She climbed into the driver's seat. The key was in the ignition. She turned it. The engine came alive, louder than she had imagined, and it startled her. But she didn't let go. She looked at the dashboard. Right foot for the gas, right foot for the brake. The gear shift. The memory of her father's hands on the shifter ran through her mind like a blueprint. D meant drive. R meant reverse. She moved it to D. The car crept forward. She pressed the gas lightly. The car moved harder. Her hands on the steering wheel were slick with blood, slippery, and she gripped tighter, hard enough that her knuckles went white beneath the blood. She drove out onto the road. Slow. Shaking. The car drifted to the right. Then she pulled it back. Rain struck the windshield, and she didn't know how to turn on the wipers, so she drove through the sheet of rain by looking through the narrow spaces between the drops. 4 miles. 1443 North Lakemont. She didn't know the way, but she saw street signs and tracked the blur of house numbers, driving deeper into the unknown, mile by mile, intersection by intersection. Blood on her hands against the wheel, the unconscious man in the back seat, and she didn't think about what she had left behind. She didn't think about Judith or the front door or those 4 words. She thought only about the thing 4 miles ahead. 1443. North Lakemont wasn't the kind of house that announced power. No iron gates, no high walls, no visible cameras. Just a wide brownstone with a brownstone facade, discreet, the kind of home passers-by would assume belonged to a successful lawyer or a retired doctor, not the home of the man who controlled the whole south side of Chicago. But every second-floor window glowed with warm yellow light in the October night, and when Maeve stopped the car in front of the steps, the way someone who had never parked a car would park it, crooked, jerking, nearly onto the curb, 2 men appeared on the front steps before she even had time to turn off the engine. They came down fast, with the footsteps of men trained to respond to all kinds of midnight situations, and both had their hands at their waists, where Maeve didn't need to look closely to know what was there. They didn't know who was driving their boss's car. Maeve opened the car door and stepped out. Blood on her shirt, half dry and half wet, clinging to the fabric in smeared reddish-brown stains, rain in her hair, thin shoes soaked through, and the eyes of someone who had just driven 4 miles for the first time in her life, with a bleeding man in the back seat, and no time to be afraid of anything except the possibility that he might stop breathing. Then a woman stepped out through the front door, 63 years old, silver hair pinned neatly up, back straight, moving with the stride of someone who regarded every crisis as something to be managed, not panicked over. Odette Shaw. She looked at the car, looked at Maeve, looked at the blood, and she didn't ask if Maeve was all right. She asked what happened. Maeve answered, "He was shot in the right abdomen, below the last rib, unconscious for about 20 minutes. He has a pulse, but it got weaker on the way here. I kept pressure on the wound from the moment I found him. He said no hospital, no police. Exact, no extra detail, no emotion." Maeve spoke in the voice of someone who had spent every bit of emotion on driving 4 miles in the rain and had nothing left to put into words. Odette turned and instructed the 2 men to bring the wounded man inside. "Now, downstairs room, call Dr. Harlan." Then another man came onto the steps. 67 years old, gray hair, broad shoulders, expensive clothes in the kind of way that didn't need to tell anyone they were expensive. Pemberton Drake stood on the steps and watched his son carried through the door with blood and mud on him, and his face gone pale, and something moved across his face, quick, deep, the sort of thing he would never let anyone see under any other circumstances. Then he mastered it again. And he looked at Maeve. She stood below the steps, small in her blood-stained clothes, rain still falling in her hair, and she looked back at him with the direct gaze of someone who didn't have the energy to look any way but the straightest way. "You were with my son," he said. "I found him after they left. I put pressure on the wound. He gave me this address." "You drove my son's car 4 miles, he said. Not a question. "Yes. Do you know how to drive?" "No." He looked at her for another 3 seconds. "Come inside," he said. "I should go." "You just drove my son's car 4 miles with a bullet in him without knowing how to drive. You're coming inside." The second time wasn't a question. Maeve went in. Odette led her to a small sitting room at the back of the house. A fire was already burning in the fireplace. Dry clothes had been placed on a chair, folded neatly, the right size, even though no one had asked her what size she wore. Hot tea sat on the small table. Then food, 1 plate, simple, bread and cheese and warm soup. And Maeve sat down and picked up the spoon and began to eat fast, by habit, in the way 11 years had taught her to eat. Fast because she never knew when the food might be taken away. Fast because she never knew when someone might come in and tell her she wasn't finished with her work. "Slow down," Odette said. She sat in the chair opposite, back straight, hands resting on her knees, looking at Maeve with the calm eyes of someone who had watched many people eat in many different circumstances and knew exactly what kind of circumstance created that way of eating. "Slow down. No one is taking it away." Maeve stopped, looked at Odette. Then she ate more slowly, and she told Odette everything. The warehouse, 4 men, the gunshot, the groan, the decision to step out. "You kept pressure on the wound for 4 miles, Odette said when Maeve finished. "He needed pressure," Maeve said. Then she stopped, looked at her hands, the blood dried dark brown inside the folds of her fingers. "I counted 247 breaths," she said, "from the warehouse to here." Odette looked at her. 40 years of judging people gathered into a single glance. "What's your name?" "Maeve Bellamy." Odette paused. Something moved across her face, slower than Judith, truer than Judith. "Franklin's daughter," she said. "Not a question. You knew my father. I knew your mother. Lorraine. She was Mr. Pemberton's nurse 30 years ago, before you were born. The kindest person I'd ever met." Maeve said nothing. She looked at the fire in the fireplace. The fire burning in the warm room of a strange house where a stranger had just spoken her mother's name, as though it still carried weight, as though Lorraine still mattered to someone besides Maeve. She counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then she stopped. And for the first time in a very long while, she stopped not because it was enough, but because she didn't need to keep counting in order to remain where she was. Corbin Drake woke at midnight. Dr. Harlan had removed the bullet, stitched the wound, bandaged it, and left through the back door because Dr. Harlan always left through the back door and never asked any question whose answer might cause trouble for him. Corbin opened his eyes in the first-floor bedroom. The room reserved for situations no one in the house ever named, but everyone understood. The room with the low bed and the dark sheets, and the medicine cabinet more fully stocked than a small clinic. Pemberton was sitting in the chair beside the bed. Back straight, eyes open. He had been sitting there since his son was carried in, and he would have stayed there until his son opened his eyes, because that was what Pemberton Drake did. He didn't walk away when one of his own was down. Corbin looked at the ceiling, then at his father, then said one word. "Whelan." Pemberton nodded. "I know." 3 seconds of silence. "Who brought me back?" Pemberton told him. Briefly. Exactly. In the way two men used to speaking to each other talked, when there was no time for anything extra. A woman. In the old warehouse in the industrial district. She saw everything. After they left, she came out. Put pressure on the wound. "You said no hospital." She listened. "You gave the address. You passed out. She drove your car back here." Corbin turned his head and looked at his father. "She drove my car. Your car. 4 miles. Does she know how to drive?" "No." Pemberton said the word flatly, but there was something underneath it. Something Corbin recognized at once because he had listened to his father's voice for 36 years and knew exactly when he was holding something back. "Doesn't know how to drive. Drove anyway." Silence. Corbin looked at the ceiling. "What's her name?" "Maeve Bellamy. Franklin Bellamy's daughter." Something moved across Pemberton's face when he said the name. Quick, controlled, but Corbin saw it. He didn't ask. He'd ask later. For now he only said, "I want to see her. Tomorrow morning." Pemberton said, "Now." Pemberton looked at his son. "You just had a bullet taken out of your stomach. Now." The second time wasn't a request. Pemberton stood up and went to get Odette. 15 minutes later, Maeve stepped into the room. 2 in the morning. She was wearing a borrowed dress. Simple. A little loose in the shoulders because it wasn't hers. Her hair still damp from the rain she hadn't had time to dry all the way. She stood in the doorway with the calm of someone who had decided that whatever happened next, she would meet it with herself because she had nothing else to use. Corbin looked at her. He was sitting propped against the pillows. White bandages wrapped around his stomach. Bruising beginning to rise along the left side of his jaw. Black hair. And in proper light, for the first time, Maeve saw him clearly. 36 years old. Gray eyes exactly like his father's. The same kind of eyes she had seen opening on the wet parking lot in the dark. But now, in the lit room, those eyes were sharper, more awake, and fixed on her with the full concentration of a man reading someone and not yet finished deciding what he thought. "You found me," he said. "Yes." "You knew I'd been shot. Not robbed." "Yes." "You knew I said no police." "Yes." Each answer was one word. No explanation. No defense. Maeve said yes in the way a person tells the truth when the truth is the only thing she has, and she sees no need to add anything to it. "And you still helped," Corbin said. Not a question, but there was space at the end of it, the kind of space he left there, in case she wanted to fill it. "You were bleeding," Maeve said. "I don't need to know why, to know that bleeding has to be stopped." Corbin looked at her, for a long time, in silence. Looked at her with the gaze of a man who had met many people in 36 years. People with reasons. People who needed something. People who came close because they were calculating. And only rarely, very rarely, People who came close for a reason so simple it was almost impossible to believe. "Sit down," he said. "I should go. Miss Bellamy, it's 2 a.m. You have nowhere to go. Sit down." She sat, in the chair across from the bed, 2 meters away, close enough to hear him breathe, far enough that they were still two strangers. "One night," he said. "Stay tonight. We'll talk in the morning." "One night," she said. Both of them understood that wasn't what either of them really meant. Corbin closed his eyes, not sleeping, but the kind of closing of the eyes a man does when he's in pain and choosing not to let anyone see how much pain. Maeve sat in the chair across from him. She didn't sleep. She watched his chest rise and fall, his breathing even, and she counted. Not counting to hold herself together this time. She counted his breaths. 14 breaths a minute. Even. Steady. She counted and counted and counted, and each number was a confirmation that this man was still breathing, still here, still alive, and Maeve realized, in the still room at 2 a.m. with the stranger and the bullet wound and the darkness beyond the window, that this was the first time in 11 years she was counting not to keep herself alive, but to keep someone else. Maeve opened her eyes at 4:53 in the morning. She knew the exact time because she had counted from the moment the first light slipped through the curtains, and she knew that October light in Chicago came through east, facing curtains at about 4:50. She was lying on the long sofa in the small sitting room where Odette had brought her the night before. A blanket pulled over her at some point she didn't remember, by someone she didn't know. She lay still, and in the first 3 seconds she was completely disoriented because her body was waiting for the thing it had spent 11 years learning to wait for. The list. 4:30. Wake up. Kitchen. Breakfast. Wipe. Clean. Cook. Her body tensed, ready for that chain of actions like a string pulled to the same tight note every morning. And when nothing happened, when there were no footsteps from Judith in the hallway, no list on the kitchen table, no Brinley calling down from the second floor, she lay there and felt the absence of all those things as a kind of ringing, the loudness of silence when silence was something she didn't know how to live inside. She counted. 1, 2, 3, counted to 60. Then she sat up, folded the blanket, straightened the pillow, and went to find Odette. She found her in the kitchen, already awake, making coffee in a mocha pot on the gas stove, with the movements of someone who had made coffee in a mocha pot every morning for 40 years, and didn't need to look at her own hands. "What do I need to do?" Maeve said. Not as a question, but as a statement, in the voice of someone who didn't know how to exist in a house without work to do. Odette looked at her. Then she gave her work. Real work, purposeful work, orderly work. Organize the laundry room, check the dry goods in the kitchen, dust the bookshelves on the second floor. Maeve did it with the efficiency of 11 years of practice. Fast, precise, not a single extra movement. But when she finished dusting the shelves and came back to the kitchen, Odette looked at her and said, "Good job." 2 words. Maeve stood in the kitchen doorway, and those 2 words fell into her in a place she hadn't prepared to receive them. Not because they were extraordinary, but because for 11 years, no one had said those 2 words to her after she finished doing anything. The difference wasn't in the work. Work was work. The difference was in the way people looked at her when she was done. At 10 in the morning, Pemberton came looking for her. She was in the small sitting room folding bed linens Odette had given her, and he came in and stood in the doorway for a moment as if weighing something, then sat down in the chair across from her. He didn't say anything for 15 seconds. Maeve counted. Then he said, "I want to tell you about your mother." Maeve stopped folding, looked at him. "You knew my mother." Not a question because Odette had said it the night before, but hearing it from the mouth of the 67-year-old man sitting across from her gave it a different weight. Pemberton nodded. 30 years ago, he said. "Eleanor, my wife, was terminally ill, lung cancer. Stage 4 when they found it, too late for anything except time. The hospital sent a home care nurse. Lorraine Bellamy." He paused, looked out the window. Lorraine came every day through the final 3 months. She didn't only do the work of a nurse. She sat with Eleanor, talked with Eleanor, read to Eleanor when Eleanor no longer had the strength to speak. And on the last night, when the doctor had already gone, when the friends had already called ahead with their condolences and gone home to sleep, when I was sitting in the next room because I didn't have the strength to sit in that room and watch my wife leave, Lorraine stayed. Pemberton looked at Maeve. His eyes, the same gray she had seen in Corbin, but softer here, softened in the way time can smooth pain without ever erasing it. She sat beside Eleanor's bed all night, held my wife's hand, until morning, until Eleanor was gone. Then she came out to the sitting room and said to me, "She's gone." She wasn't in pain. She wasn't alone. He stopped. Maeve said nothing. She couldn't say anything because her throat was closing around something she didn't have a name for. "Your mother stayed for my wife," Pemberton said. "You stayed for my son." He looked at her with 67 years in his eyes. "I don't believe in coincidence, but I do believe in the kind of person your mother was. And you're that kind of person." Maeve sat in the small sitting room of a stranger's house and heard about her mother through the mouth of a stranger. She heard about Lorraine 20 years earlier, young, strong, sitting beside a sick woman's bed through the night, not because anyone paid her extra or because anyone told her she had to stay, but because it was the right thing to do. And Lorraine was the kind of person who did the right thing even when no one was watching. Exactly what Maeve had done in the warehouse the night before, stepping into the darkness not because anyone told her to, not because she knew who that man was, but because he was bleeding and she knew how to stop the bleeding, and that was enough. She was her mother's daughter. She had always been her mother's daughter. Judith had spent 11 years trying to erase that, and for 11 years it had still been there, in Maeve's hands, in the way she pressed on a wound, in the way she counted a stranger's breaths at 2 a.m. Maeve didn't count. For the first time in a very long while, she didn't count. She breathed. On the first day, Maeve didn't see Corbin. He was recovering in the first-floor room, and Dr. Harlan had instructed him not to move for 48 hours. And Corbin followed the doctor's orders not because he was afraid of pain, but because he understood that a bullet in the abdomen demanded a kind of patience he didn't enjoy but wasn't foolish enough to ignore. On the second day, Maeve began to sense him. Not see him, sense him. She was dusting the second-floor bookshelves, her back to the hallway, and she knew someone was watching her. She didn't turn around. She kept dusting. But she knew, with the instinct that 9 years of living with Judith had honed so sharply it was almost impossible for it to be wrong. 11 years in the house on Bellamy Street had taught Maeve how to feel when she was being watched. Judith watched with light footsteps at the end of the hallway, with a reflection in the glass of a cabinet, by standing in a doorway just long enough for Maeve to know she was there, but not long enough for Maeve to say she was staring. Judith watched in order to find faults, to gather something for Monday inspection, to keep Maeve in the state of always knowing she was being judged without ever knowing exactly when she was being judged. It was a form of control, and Maeve had understood that by the time she was 20 and lived with it for 7 more years by not reacting, not turning, not letting Judith know that she knew, but she had always known. And now, in the house on North Lakemont, she knew again. Someone was watching her from the far end of the second-floor hallway. She finished dusting the shelf, went downstairs to the kitchen, didn't turn around. That afternoon, she was folding towels in the laundry room, and again she felt it. Lightly, at the door. Someone stood there for 30 seconds, then left. She counted the footsteps fading away. Heavier than Judith's, slower than Judith's. The footsteps of someone who was walking away but didn't want to. Someone leaving but still wanting to stay long enough to look a little longer. The second day ended, and Corbin still hadn't said a word to her. On the third day, Maeve was walking down the second-floor hallway with a stack of clean sheets in her arms that Odette had given her, and she felt him there, to her left, in the strip of darkness between 2 doorways, where the hallway light didn't reach. She knew he was there. She knew he was watching. And this time she didn't keep walking. She stopped, set the stack of sheets down on the small hallway table, turned back, looked straight into the darkness. "If you want to ask something, ask it," she said, her voice flat, not defiant, not afraid, only the truth spoken in the voice of someone too tired of being watched without being spoken to. "Standing in the dark and staring at me won't get you answers." 2 seconds of silence. Then Corbin stepped out. He stood at the edge of the light, one hand resting lightly over his abdomen, where the bandage lay beneath his shirt, and Maeve saw his face for the first time in daylight since that night in the first-floor bedroom. The bruise along his jaw had turned from purple to yellow-green. His gray eyes were still sharp, and he was smiling. Very slightly. Just enough for one corner of his mouth to lift. The kind of smile Maeve suspected very few people had ever seen, because it wasn't the kind of smile he used on everyone. It looked like the kind of smile someone kept for moments when he was truly surprised, and Maeve understood that she had just done something very few people dared to do: look straight into the dark where Corbin Drake was standing and tell him to step out. "You ask a lot," he said. "I didn't ask anything," Maeve said. "I told you to ask." His smile deepened by 0.5 millimeter. Then he asked, not loudly, quietly, "What do you read? What do you know about first aid besides applying pressure? Where did you learn?" And Maeve answered, one question at a time, carefully, without excess. And from that afternoon on the third day, they began to talk. Not the kind of talking people do when they want to impress each other, or when they are trying to force a connection. This was the kind of talking two wary people do when both know that every word is being weighed, and both accept that. One sentence at a time, slowly becoming more real. On the fourth night, Maeve woke to the sound of voices. Not loud voices, but the kind of low, steady voices she had learned to hear through walls and floors during 11 years in the Bellamy house, because those kinds of voices usually carried things more important than shouting ever did. She lay still in bed in the room Odette had arranged for her on the second floor, and she listened. Corbin's voice. From downstairs, the study at the back of the house, the room she had never been invited into, and she understood that she wasn't supposed to enter it. She sat up, not out of curiosity, but because 11 years with Judith had taught her that conversations happening after midnight, in closed rooms, were the conversations she needed to know about in order to survive. She opened her door, went out into the hallway, sat down on the top step of the staircase, in the place where the dark was deep enough to keep her unseen, but the sound from downstairs could still rise to her. Corbin's voice. Cold, flat, completely different from the voice he used when speaking to her in the hallway that afternoon. That voice had at least one thin layer of warmth beneath it, even if he tried to hide it. This voice had no layers. This voice was steel. "Whelan is on the west side," someone said. A strange voice, one Maeve didn't recognize. Corbin said, "I know where Whelan is." Silence. Then Corbin said several more things that Maeve couldn't hear word for word, but she could hear the tone, and in that tone was the word handle, and she knew that handle, in this context, in this house, from the mouth of this man, wasn't figurative. It didn't mean talk or negotiate or hand it off to a lawyer. It meant the thing she had seen in the parking lot 4 nights earlier. Except this time Corbin was on the side giving the order instead of the side taking the bullet. Maeve sat on the staircase and counted her own breaths. 1, 2, 3, 12 breaths. Then she stood up, went back to her room, lay down on the bed, stared at the ceiling, and didn't sleep another second until morning. The next morning, the dining table. Maeve sat in the chair she had sat in for the past 3 days, the chair at the end of the table near the kitchen door, the place she had chosen for herself because it was closest to the exit, and 11 years had taught her always to sit closest to the exit. Corbin came into the kitchen, still moving slowly because of the wound, his left hand resting lightly against his abdomen in a habit he didn't notice, but Maeve did, because Maeve noticed everything. He sat down. Odette set coffee in front of him. He drank. Maeve watched him drink his coffee, and while he lifted the cup to his mouth, she decided that she was going to say it. "I sat on the stairs last night," she said. Corbin stopped moving, the coffee cup halfway between his mouth and the table. He looked at her. "I heard you talking," she said. "I know who you are. I knew from the first night. Not the night in the parking lot. That night in the parking lot, she suspected. The night on the stairs, she confirmed. And now she said it aloud because she had lived too long with pretending not to know, and she didn't want to do that anymore in another house. Silence. Long. Corbin set the coffee cup down on the table, slowly. His eyes didn't leave her face. "And you're still here," he said. Not a question, but with that familiar space at the end. The same kind of space he had left at the end of his sentence that first night in the downstairs bedroom. "I lived with someone dangerous for 11 years, Maeve said. "The difference is Judith hid it. You don't." Corbin looked at her, longer than he ever had before, and Maeve looked back, not in challenge, but with the calm of someone who had finished telling the truth and was waiting to see how that truth would be received. He didn't say anything more. He finished his coffee, stood up, walked to the kitchen door, stopped in the doorway, turned to look at her one more time, then left. Maeve sat at the dining table. Odette stood at the sink, her back to Maeve, washing dishes, and Maeve thought she had heard all of it, but she said nothing, and Maeve was grateful for that. Then Odette turned off the water, dried her hands on a towel, turned back, sat down in the chair across from Maeve, in the place where Pemberton had sat the morning before, and looked at her with 63-year-old eyes that had seen enough not to be surprised anymore, but were still soft enough to know when someone needed to be asked. "Are you all right?" Odette said. Maeve looked at her, and that question, 3 simple words, fell into her at a place where she had no defense, no count, no preparation, because the last time anyone had asked her that, and truly wanted the answer, was 11 years earlier, from Lorraine's bed, from Lorraine's own mouth. "I don't know," Maeve said, truthfully, without hiding. "I haven't been asked that in a very long time." Odette looked at her, then she said, in a voice as level and steady as the wooden table between them, "Then here, you will be asked." On the 5th night, Maeve passed Corbin's room on her way back to her own, after helping Odette do the final check of the kitchen. His door was slightly open, not open in a way that invited anyone in, but open in the way of someone who hadn't thought to close it, because he didn't expect anyone to be passing by at that hour. Maeve didn't stop out of curiosity. She stopped because the light from his desk lamp was spilling through the crack in the door onto the hallway floor in a thin strip of gold. And in that strip of light, she saw his shadow sitting perfectly still, and the silence inside that room was different from the silence she had grown used to in this house. Heavier, more private, the kind of silence people have only when they are alone with the thing they don't let anyone else see. She looked through the narrow opening. Corbin was sitting at the desk, his back slightly bent, and in front of him on the desk was a small photograph. Maeve couldn't see the picture clearly from where she stood, but she could see enough. A woman, dark hair, a smile that even from this distance and through the half-open door she recognized as his, alike in the curve at the corner of the mouth, alike in something in the eyes she couldn't fully make out but could still feel. His mother. Corbin's hand rested on the photograph, not gripping it, just resting there, lightly, like a man touching something he knows he can't keep and still can't make himself let go of. And Maeve looked at the man she had heard 2 nights earlier using the word handle in a voice made of steel, the man the whole south side of Chicago feared, the man she had told to his face that she knew exactly who he was, and in that moment she saw that he wasn't any of those people. He was a 12-year-old boy who had lost his mother and had never healed. Maeve walked away, didn't speak, didn't knock, didn't let him know she had seen. She went back to her room, lay down on the bed, stared at the ceiling, and the way she saw Corbin Drake changed that night, not in any large way or any obvious way, only that some new layer settled into the way she held the image of him in her mind, a layer she didn't yet have a name for. But it was there. The 6th day passed normally. The 7th day did not. Maeve went back to her room at 4 o'clock in the afternoon after helping Odette organize the laundry room. She opened the door, stepped inside, and stopped. On her pillow, placed neatly in the center, was a photograph. Black and white, printed on ordinary paper, taken from a security camera, grainy, blurred, but clear enough. A woman standing in the parking lot behind the warehouse. Brown hair, her face turned partly away, looking down at something on the ground. Maeve looked at the photograph and realized the woman in it was her. That night, that parking lot, the moment she had knelt beside Corbin. No note, no message, no line of text, just the photograph. And the frightening thing wasn't the photograph itself. The frightening thing was that someone had entered this house, gone up to the 2nd floor, stepped into her room, and placed it on her pillow while she was downstairs only 1 staircase away. Someone belonging to Whelan, inside the Drake house. Maeve looked at the photograph, counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Her hand didn't shake. 11 years of living with Judith had taught her not to shake when she was being threatened, because shaking was what Judith looked for, and Maeve had learned never to give anyone the thing they were looking for. She picked up the photograph, went downstairs, walked into the study where Corbin was sitting, placed the photograph in front of him, said nothing, let him see it. Corbin looked at the photograph. His eyes changed, still the same gray, but what was behind them became something entirely different. Colder, sharper, the thing she had heard in his voice the night on the stairs but had never before seen on his face, and now she saw it, and she understood why people feared him. He stood up, walked to the door of the study, stood there, between her and the hallway. between her and the outside world. He didn't tell her not to be afraid, or that he would protect her, or any of the things an ordinary man would have said. He simply stood in the doorway, using his body to take the position between her and anything that might come from outside. Then he made 3 phone calls, each one under a minute, his voice flat, cold, every word carrying the weight of specific consequences. She couldn't hear the exact content, but she could hear the voice, and the voice was enough. He ended the 3rd call, turned to look at her. "It's handled," he said. "What does handled mean?" Maeve said. "It means no one comes into your room again." Maeve looked at him, looked at the study door where he had just been standing, looked at the phone in his hand, looked back into his eyes, gray eyes that had shifted from cold into something else, something she wasn't sure he wanted her to see. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, "but I'll never pretend to like that part of you." Corbin looked at her, for a long time, in silence. "No one has ever said that to me so directly," he said. "Then now someone has," Maeve said. That night, Maeve lay staring at the ceiling of her room in the Drake house and didn't sleep. She thought about the photograph on her pillow, about the parking lot blurred on cheap paper, about someone walking down the hallway she crossed every day, opening the door to the room where she slept every night, placing a message on the pillow where she laid her head, then disappearing without anyone in this house full of armed men knowing. She thought about Corbin standing in the doorway of the study, his body filling the frame, 3 calls in under a minute, handled. She thought about the black notebook beneath the loose floorboard in her room at the Bellamy house. 5 years of records. Every day, every dose, every symptom, lying there alone in the dark, waiting for her to come back for it. And she thought about Lorraine's journal, the small blue notebook her mother had written in every night before the illness, lying in the desk drawer of the master bedroom that Judith now occupied, and the wedding ring, the thin gold band Franklin had placed on Lorraine's finger 29 years earlier, the ring Lorraine wore until the day she died, and afterward Franklin kept it in his bedside drawer because he couldn't bear to look at it, but he couldn't bear not to have it near him either. Judith wouldn't think the ring had value because it wasn't expensive, and Judith measured value in money. Maeve couldn't wait for someone else to go get them for her. These were her mother's things. This was her evidence. This was her work. The next morning, she went down to the kitchen while Corbin was drinking coffee. "I need to go back to the Bellamy house," she said. Corbin set his cup down, looked at her. "To get what?" "The notebook I hid under the floorboard in my room. My mother's journal, my mother's wedding ring." Corbin didn't ask what notebook. He had heard enough in 7 days to know that Maeve didn't say unnecessary things, and if she said she needed to get something, then she needed to get it. "I'm going with you," he said. "No." Maeve said the word in the same voice she had used when she told him to step out of the darkness in the hallway. A flat voice, not challenging, only true. "You handle Whelan. Judith is mine to handle." 3 seconds of silence. Corbin looked at her, and Maeve saw in his eyes the brief struggle between protective instinct and respect. And respect won. Not easily, but it won, because he understood that protecting someone didn't mean locking them away, and if he locked her away, he wouldn't be any different from Judith. He nodded. "2 of my men will drive you. They'll wait outside. You go in alone." 40 minutes later, Maeve was sitting in a black car with 2 silent men in the front seat, and the car stopped in front of the Bellamy house on the road she had walked away from 7 nights earlier in October. Rain with no coat, no money, no phone. She stepped out, looked at the house, same front door, but she wasn't the same person. She walked up the steps, put her hand on the front doorknob, the door she had crossed only once in 11 years, the night she left. She opened it, stepped inside. For the first time in 9 years, Maeve Bellamy entered her father's house through the front door. Judith was in the living room, sitting in an armchair, teacup on the table, Brinley on the staircase above. Judith looked at Maeve walking in, and nothing changed on her face because Judith had prepared for this moment. She always prepared for every moment. "You've come back," Judith said, her voice warm, soft, the voice she used for Franklin, for guests, for anyone she needed to believe she was kind. "I'm here to get my mother's things," Maeve said, her journal, her wedding ring. "Maeve, sit down. Let's talk first. The journal, the ring. Then I'm leaving." Judith changed. Her voice turned cold, quickly, at the same speed Maeve had seen 1,000 times when the warm strategy failed. "Who do you think you are, coming back here making demands?" Maeve didn't answer. She walked straight through the living room, past Judith, up the stairs. Brinley stood at the railing watching her pass, and Maeve went into her room, the small room at the end of the hall, the room without heat, the room where she had slept for 11 years. She knelt in the corner, found the loose floorboard, lifted it. The black notebook was there, beside the photograph of Lorraine in the garden, exactly where she had left it 5 years earlier. She took both, stood up. Judith was in the doorway. She had followed Maeve upstairs without a sound. Or maybe Maeve had heard the footsteps and simply didn't care anymore. Judith looked at the notebook in Maeve's hand, and for the first time in the 11 years Maeve had known her, Judith's face changed. Not the kind of change she controlled the way she controlled all the others. A real change. Control slid off her face like water slipping off glass, and what was underneath showed for 5 full seconds before she pulled it back into place. Fear. Real fear. "That doesn't belong to you," Judith said. "No," Maeve said. "But what's in here belongs to you. Every dose. Every night." She looked at Judith. 11 years of looking at this woman. And this was the first time Maeve looked at her without lowering her eyes. "I've been counting for 9 years," Maeve said. "What did you think I was counting?" Maeve stepped out of her room with the black notebook in her left hand and Lorraine's photograph in her right, and Judith was still standing in the doorway, her face having pulled its control back into place, but not entirely. Something still left at the corner of her eyes that Maeve saw and registered, and didn't need to mention because she had already said enough. She walked past Judith. Didn't touch her. Didn't look back. She moved down the hallway toward the stairs, and there, exactly where she knew she would be, Brinley was standing on the staircase. Brinley had been there the whole time, from the moment Maeve stepped through the front door, from the moment she went upstairs, from the moment she knelt to lift the floorboard, from the moment Judith followed and stood in the doorway. Brinley had stood on the stairs and watched all of it with the eyes of someone watching a play she had occupied the front row for during 11 years, but was seeing from a different angle for the first time. Maeve stopped, not because Brinley was blocking her way, but because she chose to stop. She looked at Brinley, 28 years old, blonde, the face Maeve had looked at for 9 years at the breakfast table, at Monday inspection, at the 3rd breakfast tray sent back, the face she had once seen only as the easy comfort of someone sitting safely on the other side of injustice. But now, on that staircase, Maeve looked at Brinley with the eyes of someone who had stepped outside this house and turned back to look at it. And she saw something she had never allowed herself to see before, because while she was still trapped inside the system, she had never had enough distance to see it clearly. "She's doing it to you too," Maeve said. Her voice was soft, not angry, not accusing. Only the truth spoken in the voice of someone who had lived with that thing long enough to recognize it in any form, different shape. Same thing. "You know that." Brinley didn't speak. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes looked at Maeve, then down, then back at Maeve again. And Maeve saw in those eyes something she recognized at once, because she had carried it in herself for years before she had language for it. Knowing, Brinley knew that something was wrong. Knew that the way her mother loved her wasn't love but investment. Knew that her privilege wasn't a gift but a velvet-wrapped chain. Knew it, but wasn't allowed to say it because to say it aloud would mean losing everything Judith had built around her. And Brinley didn't know who she was without those things. Brinley's hand rested on the stair rail. It was trembling. Slightly. Very slightly. Enough for Maeve to see. Maeve didn't say anything more. She walked down the stairs, past Brinley, and she didn't touch her and didn't stop again because this wasn't the moment, and she knew it. She had planted the seed. Seeds needed time. She went to the master bedroom. Franklin's room, the room that had once belonged to Franklin and Lorraine, and now belonged to Franklin and Judith, except Judith wasn't here, and Franklin was always here, in the chair by the window, looking out at the garden Lorraine had planted, with the fogged eyes Maeve had seen thousands of times, and every time it had hurt, she knelt beside his chair, took his hand. The hand was warm but weak, light, the hand of a man who had had everything taken from him without knowing it. "Dad," she said. "It's Maeve." Franklin looked at her. His eyes were blurred, distant, somewhere in the place the medicine carried him to every night. Then something moved, very deep, very far away, like a man trying to swim up to the surface from very deep water. "Lorraine," he said. "No, Dad. Me. Maeve. Your daughter." 5 seconds. 5 seconds in which Franklin's eyes cleared, the fog lifting for a single moment. And he looked at her, truly looked at her, and he gripped her hand with more strength than she thought he had left. 5 seconds in which he was here. Then the gray veil returned. His hand loosened. His eyes lost their anchor. He turned again toward the garden he couldn't see. Maeve stood up, walked to the bedside drawer, opened it. Lorraine's wedding ring lay in the corner of the drawer beside an empty pill bottle and a few old papers. Thin gold. Plain. No diamond, no stone. The kind of ring two young people buy when they don't have much money but have everything else. Judith had left it there because she looked at that ring and saw cheap gold. Maeve looked at that ring and saw her mother. She slipped it onto her little finger. It fit. She left the Bellamy house through the front door, the notebook in her coat pocket. Lorraine's photograph pressed against her chest, her mother's ring on her hand. She walked down the steps to the black car waiting outside, and she didn't look back. Pemberton set the machinery in motion within 24 hours after Maeve brought the notebook back to the Drake house. Not the underground machinery, but the legal one. Lawyers, doctors, documents, the right people in the right positions moving in the right direction. Because Pemberton Drake understood that some wars had to be won with guns, and some had to be won with paper, and this war belonged to the second kind. Dr. Vance was brought in. He arrived carrying Franklin's medical records from the previous 5 years. Blood test results he had suspected were wrong but had never had strong enough evidence to act on, and when he looked at Maeve's notebook, every day, every hour, every dosage matching exactly what he had seen in those lab results, his face changed in the way only a doctor's face changes, when they realize they have been reading a patient wrong for years, not because they were incompetent, but because someone had been blinding them. Edith Crane, the Bellamy family's cook, 64 years old, the woman who had worked in that kitchen for 30 years and was the only person who had treated Maeve like a human being, was contacted by Pemberton's lawyer. Edith came, sat down, and told everything she had seen, in the lightly trembling voice of someone who had stayed silent too long because she had never held the power to change anything. But now someone was asking, and she was going to speak until she had nothing left unsaid. The trial took place 6 weeks later. Judith sat at the defense table in the finest suit she owned, back straight, hair perfectly arranged, her face composed into the expression she had practiced her entire life, the expression of a dignified woman being wronged. She performed first. Her lawyer let her speak, and Judith spoke about Franklin in the soft, faintly trembling voice of a worried wife devoted to her sick husband. She spoke about the medications the doctor had prescribed, about dosages followed exactly as directed, about her devotion in making tea for her husband every evening because she loved him. Then she spoke about Maeve. She spoke in the voice Maeve had heard for 11 years. Gentle, but each word placed with precision like a brick in the wall she was building between the truth and her own version of it. Maeve has been unstable since childhood, Judith said. She lost her mother too young. She imagines things. She counts, writes things down, obsesses over things that aren't real. She needs help, not a courtroom. She said the word pitiable in a voice that, if you didn't know Judith, might have made you believe she truly pitied Maeve. She said the words not reliable in a voice that, if you didn't know Judith, might have made you think she was trying to protect a young woman from her own delusions. Judith performed. She performed with everything she had, because performance was what she did best, what had brought her into the Bellamy house, into Franklin's bed, into Franklin's will, and she would have performed her way out of that courtroom too, if the trial had rested only on words. Maeve sat and listened, expressionless. 11 years of practice sitting and listening to Judith speak without expression, and this was the last time she would need that skill. She sat with her back straight, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes forward, and she didn't react when Judith called her unstable, didn't react when Judith called her imaginative, didn't react when Judith called her unreliable, because reaction was what Judith looked for, and for 11 years Maeve had never given her the thing she was looking for. Then it was Maeve's turn. Maeve stood up, walked to the front, held the black notebook, opened to the first page, and began to read. March 14th, 9:07 p.m., 2 pills. Franklin disoriented for 40 minutes, did not recognize his daughter. Her voice was even, without emotion, without tremor, without anger, exact down to every number, because this was what she had done for 5 years. Count and write, count and write, and every number in that notebook was a night she had sat in her room without heat and written down what that woman was doing to her father. March 22nd, 9:15 p.m. 3 pills. Franklin fell down the stairs. Judith said he lost his balance. Judith tried to interrupt. Her lawyer stood and objected. Overruled. Maeve kept reading. April 4th, 9:02 p.m. 2 pills. Franklin called Maeve Lorraine for the entire evening. Did not remember whether he had eaten. 1 page after another. 1 month after another. 5 years. Maeve read in the steady voice of someone reciting a multiplication table. And that steadiness was the most frightening thing in the courtroom. Not anger, but the complete absence of anger. The cold precision of someone who had turned grief into data and data into evidence. Judith sat at the defense table and listened. And with each page Maeve turned, with each date, time, dosage, and symptom spoken aloud in that emotionless voice, Judith understood. The girl she had called the maid, the girl she had called unstable, imaginative, unreliable. That girl had sat in her freezing corner of the house every night for 9 years and recorded every move Judith made. Every pill, every cup of tea, every time Franklin forgot, every time his eyes clouded. That girl had counted, and Judith had never known. Judith's face changed. Not a dramatic collapse like in films, but a collapse the way systems collapse. Slowly, from the inside, one layer of control peeling away after another, the dignified expression slipping to reveal the calculating one, the calculating expression slipping to reveal the frightened one, and the frightened one slipping to reveal the last thing underneath it all, the emptiness of a woman realizing that the game she had played for 11 years had just ended, not with an explosion, but with the sound of pages turning. The court delivered its verdict. Judith Price was found guilty. She was removed from the Bellamy house. Maeve sat in her chair in the courtroom after everyone else had gone. She looked at the black notebook on the table in front of her. 5 years. Every page. Every night. She placed her hand on the notebook. Didn't grip it. Just rested it there. And she breathed. Franklin Bellamy didn't recover in a straight line. The haze receded in layers, slowly, unevenly, like the tide pulling back and leaving things on the sand each time that the water had carried away forever. Dr. Vance told Maeve plainly at the second appointment after Judith was taken away that years of continuous high-dose sedatives had caused short-term memory damage that would never fully heal, that Franklin would have good days and bad days, that bad days didn't mean he was getting worse, only that the brain needed time, and time was something no one controlled. Maeve listened, nodded, didn't cry. She had spent 11 years watching her father disappear behind that layer of fog, and she had learned that crying didn't help. Only counting helped. Only recording helped. Only action helped. So she acted. She cleaned the Bellamy house, threw away the pill bottles, changed the sheets, opened the windows, and let the November wind blow through and clear out the scent of Judith's perfume still clinging to the curtains. She hired a home care nurse because Pemberton insisted on paying for it, and Maeve had learned that there were times when accepting help wasn't weakness but intelligence. Winter was hard. Franklin forgot more than he remembered. There were days when he called Maeve Lorraine from morning until night. There were days when he didn't recognize his own house. There were days when he sat in the window chair and cried without knowing what he was crying for. Maeve sat beside him on those days. She didn't correct him, didn't explain. She just sat. She had learned at the Drake house that sometimes being beside someone didn't mean fixing them. It meant enduring with them, and she knew how to endure. She was better at that than anything. In the spring, Franklin sat at the dining table for the first time without anyone guiding him there. He pulled out the chair himself, sat down himself, lifted the spoon himself. He didn't remember what day it was, but he remembered that this was the dining table, and Maeve was sitting across from him, and that was enough. In the summer, he took morning walks, slowly, with Maeve beside him, out into the garden Lorraine had planted, the garden Judith had never touched in 9 years, because she didn't care about flowers, and the garden had kept growing because flowers don't need anyone to care about them in order to grow. They only need soil and water and time. Franklin looked at the garden and said, "Lorraine planted this." "Yes, Dad." "Beautiful." "Yes, Dad." "Beautiful." Then one long, clear day. Longer than any day since that final Sunday afternoon before Maeve walked out. Franklin sat at the kitchen table, his eyes clear, and Maeve looked at him and knew at once that today he was here, truly here. He looked at her. looked for a long time. Then he looked at her hand. Maeve's hand rested on the table, the hand she never thought about because it was only a hand. It worked, it cleaned, it cooked, it pressed on wounds, it drove a car. Franklin lifted her hand, gently, turned it over in his own, and looked. Calloused. Rough. The crack at the tip of her index finger that had never fully healed because she had washed dishes in hot water every day for 9 years. The thick callus in her palm from years of hauling things and scrubbing floors and washing bed linens by hand because Judith said the washing machine used too much electricity. The hands of a laborer, not the hands his daughter should have had. Franklin looked at his daughter's hands and something broke across his face. A silent internal shattering, only the understanding arriving 9 years late and hurting exactly as much as 9 years deserved to hurt. "I'm sorry," he said. Maeve counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Stopped. "You don't need to apologize," she said. "You need to be here." "I am here," he said. "Then that's enough," she said. Autumn. Maeve was in the kitchen with Edith, 64 years old, her back a little more bent than the season before, her hands still quick over the cutting board, still chopping onions with the old knife she had used for 30 years because she said new knives didn't understand her hand. Franklin was in the dining room eating supper with Dr. Vance. 2 old men talking about weather and books and nothing important. And then Franklin laughed. A real laugh. Full. Unprotected. The sound of laughter came from the dining room into the kitchen, and Maeve stopped. She set down what she was holding, placed both hands on the kitchen counter, breathed, didn't count, didn't need to count, just breathed. Edith came to stand beside her, put one hand on Maeve's back, said nothing, because saying nothing was the thing that was needed. 3 weeks later, Brinley found Maeve, not at the Bellamy house, at a small coffee shop on Halstead, neutral ground, a place that belonged to no one. Brinley sat across from Maeve, her coffee untouched, her hands wrapped around the cup in the way people hold something when they need their hands busy so they won't shake. "Why did you say that to me?" Brinley said. "On the stairs that day." "Why?" "Because I know what that feels like," Maeve said. "Knowing something is wrong and not being allowed to say it." A long silence. Brinley looked down at her coffee. "I don't know who I am if I'm not her daughter," Brinley said, and her voice shook on the last word. Lightly, almost too softly to hear. But Maeve heard it, because Maeve heard everything. "Then now you find out," Maeve said. No embrace. No tears. 2 women sitting in a coffee shop on Halstead, drinking coffee, sitting in silence, and beginning something slow and difficult and nameless, but real. Corbin Drake came to the Bellamy house every Thursday. No one told him to come. No one invited him. He simply came. 6 o'clock in the evening. The sound of a car pulling up outside the gate. The sound of footsteps climbing the front steps. The knock on the door that Maeve began recognizing by the 2nd Thursday. And by the 4th Thursday she realized she was listening for that knock from 5:45 on. He sat with Franklin in the living room. He brought books. The first week it was a book about the history of Chicago that Franklin turned through for a few pages, and then forgot what he was reading. The next week it was a book about gardening that Franklin held on to longer, because the cover showed flowers like Lorraine's garden. Corbin sat there and listened while Franklin talked about Lorraine, told the same story again and again, because Franklin didn't remember he had already told it, and Corbin listened each time as though it were the first, because he understood that a person's past is part of that person, and listening to that past is a way of honoring who they are in the present. Maeve watched from the kitchen. She watched through the half-open door, and she saw Corbin sitting with her father, patient, quiet, listening. And every Thursday what she saw when she looked at him grew a little fuller, a little deeper, a little closer to the thing she still didn't name because she had never needed to name something in order to know it was there. One Thursday evening, the kitchen. Edith washing dishes, Maeve wiping down the table. Corbin had just left. The sound of his car faded beyond the gate. Edith stood at the sink with her back to Maeve, her hands still in the dishwater, and she said without looking up, "I cooked in this house for 30 years. I know how people look at each other when they think nobody notices. That boy doesn't know how to hide it." Maeve stopped wiping the table, looked at Edith's back. "Don't look at me," Edith said. "I'm only telling the truth." That night, Corbin walked out toward the gate. Maeve stood at the kitchen window watching him cross toward the car, and he stopped at the gate. Didn't turn around, just stopped. Stood there for 2 seconds, 3 seconds, like a man deciding whether to turn back, then started walking again. Maeve opened the kitchen door, stepped out onto the back porch. Corbin. He turned around. She stood on the back steps, still wearing her kitchen apron, hair twisted up in a quick knot, her hands still damp from dishwater. She didn't think about any of it. She didn't think about how she looked, or what she ought to say, or whether this was the right moment. She only knew Edith was right, and she had counted enough things in her life, and she didn't want to count one more day in which she knew something and said nothing. Edith says you don't know how to hide it, she said. Corbin stood very still, gray eyes on her in the evening light. Hide what? He said, but his voice had changed. Lower now, closer to something he almost never let show, something she had seen once through a half-open door when he sat in front of his mother's photograph. Maeve stepped down from the porch. 1 step, 2 steps, stopped an arm's length away from him. Is there something you want to say to me? She said. I have a great many things I want to say to you, he said. I just haven't found the... Don't find them, Maeve said. Say them. Corbin didn't speak. He reached into his coat pocket, took out a key, a house key. 1443 North Lakemont. He placed it in her hand. You don't have to use it, he said. But you have it. Maeve looked at the key in her palm, in the same rough, calloused hand her father had lifted and studied and apologized over. She looked up, looked at him. I've already used it, she said, from the night I drove your car home without knowing how to drive. Corbin laughed. A real laugh. The laugh she had seen once, very small, in the hallway on the 3rd day, when she told him to step out of the dark. But this time it was larger, fuller, completely unguarded, the kind of laugh so rare that Maeve understood she was looking at something very few people had ever seen in Corbin Drake. She laughed too. A real smile. The smile she had kept inside herself for 11 years because there had been no one worth bringing it out for. Rain began to fall, softly, a few drops on their shoulders. Rain again, Maeve said. This time you have a coat, Corbin said. Judith Price came out of prison and stepped into a world that had rearranged itself completely without requiring her opinion. The Bellamy house belonged to Franklin. Franklin recovered, not completely, but enough. Maeve was no longer where Judith had left her. Judith had left Maeve with nothing in her hands, and it turned out that empty hands became a warehouse in the night, and the warehouse in the night became everything. Edith Crane retired with the pension Maeve arranged for her, and accepted it with the dignity of a woman who had done right for 30 years and decided to allow herself to be cared for. Franklin Bellamy walked his daughter down the aisle of a small church on a June morning. He held her hand at the church doors a little longer than he needed to before letting go, and that was exactly right. Pemberton Drake stood in the front pew and tried to keep the stern look expected of a man in his position, but failed completely because he had liked Maeve from the night she drove his son's car 4 miles without knowing how to drive, and he had stopped trying to hide that a long time ago. Maeve Bellamy didn't accept herself because someone approved of her. She had never needed anyone's approval to know her own worth. She had learned that in the dark warehouse when she stepped out because someone was bleeding and she knew how to stop it, and that was enough. Some people spend their whole lives counting the days they endure. Maeve Bellamy counted for 11 years, and then she stopped counting and stepped out into the dark. It turned out that what she had been counting all along wasn't the days she endured, it was the days she was preparing. Sometimes life places us in its darkest places, not to destroy us, but so we can find the light we didn't know we were carrying. Maeve didn't wait for someone to save her. She stepped out, and when she stepped out, she didn't only save the stranger in the parking lot. She saved herself. If this story touched you, if Judith made your blood boil, if you held your breath when Maeve said, "Don't find them, say them, tell us." How did this story make you feel? What did it remind you of in your real life? Leave a comment below. We read every line, and we want to hear what you feel from the deepest part of your heart. Press like so this story can reach more people. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it today. And if this is your first time here, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the new stories each week. The stories that will stay in your heart long after the video ends. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for being here. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.